I'm joined here by Greg Marsh, the founder of Nous, who helps households with the cost of living and figuring all of that out, plus the director of think tank IPPR North, Zoe Billingham, and our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, who's been with me here in Grimsby all day. Right, let's get stuck in, shall we? So much to unpack in what is a big historic budget for so many reasons. Should we start with who were the winners and the losers? Greg, I'll come to you first.
I think the really salient thing is just how much more money will be in the pockets of people on the very lowest wages. Minimum wage earners, if you're on a full-time salary, about £1,400 a year more in your pocket, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so it's, I think, a really big benefit from today's budget. Be a little more cautious if you are earning an income but don't qualify for benefits. Because although the headline rates of income tax, VAT and national insurance haven't risen, stealth taxes are still there. Until 2028-29, you are still going to be paying a lot more than you would have done every month, but through that invidious stealth taxation. So good for very low income earners, not so good for people who are a bit further up the income spectrum.
Yeah, the middle classes, as they're called. Zoe, what about you? Who are the winners and losers for you today?
So for me, this was a really interesting budget in terms of fairness, because the Chancellor really did stick to her word in terms of making sure that working people were protected from the increases. Greg's absolutely right that the kind of income tax bracket creep will go on until 2028, but after that, the government has said they will end the freeze of income tax thresholds, which means people won't kind of accidentally fall into a new income tax bracket. So they have really kept their word to working people, and rebalance this instead with looking at taxes on people who earn money from assets, from income, from rents or dividends or shares, which has been a historic unfairness in our taxation system. So I'm really pleased today to see this rebalancing of the tax system, just to make it that little bit fairer between those who earn income from work and those who earn income from assets.
Yeah, Gurpreet, what about you?
I think what was so interesting about it is that we kind of see how circular all of these things are. We talk about who are the winners and who are the losers, but actually in an indirect way, we all kind of pay the price and we all reap the benefit. So we're talking about national minimum wage going up, for example. When the national minimum wage goes up, those who earn salaries that are slightly higher than the national minimum wage often end up benefiting as well, because it leads to a general move up in wages across the economy. And then when we're talking about, for example, national insurance contributions, well, taxes on businesses often end up, workers often end up paying the prices when it comes to their wages that they can claim. And also, let's look at local council funding, for example. Local councils saw an increase in their core spending power, but local authorities are also massive employers. And one of the things that local councils have been warning about in recent days is that national insurance contributions are going to hit them hard. So we can talk about the winners and we can talk about the losers, but actually we're all kind of
Nobody escapes tax, do they? Nobody escapes the effects of tax. Let's get on to some of the questions that people have been sending in. Greg, I'm going to ask you about this first one. This is from Alice. My partner and I are first-time buyers looking to purchase a flat in London. What do the changes today mean for us? Does it mean it's going to be easier or harder for us to get on the property ladder? Because that, of course, is the thing. People listen to the budget and go, well, hang on a second, getting through the weeds of it, what does it actually mean for what I want to do?
Yeah, and I think if you're thinking about buying in London, you're probably doing pretty well for yourself, because it's an expensive place to buy a flat. I think it's really mixed news for first-time buyers. So there's two things going on. One is, of course, less to do with today's budget unless the markets have reacted very badly, which so far they haven't. So it looks like the Bank of England's plan gradually to reduce interest rates will hopefully continue, and as that happens, the cost of mortgages will come down. So at face value, if you can afford to wait for a bit especially, you're likely to see the cost of that mortgage decrease, which means more affordability, which means you'll be able to stretch your budget. On the other side of things, now, although the Chancellor talked today about wanting to see many new homes built and more than £3 billion being allocated to new home building, stamp duty relief for first-time buyers is disappearing from March, which means that someone who's thinking about buying their first property is likely to see the costs of that in tax terms rise by an equivalent about £3,500 on average for a first-time buyer. So it's a bit of give and take. I'd say probably on balance, if the markets continue to go well, good news. But from the specifics of today's budget, bad news.
And that's what we mean by doing these expert panels, even though their issue wasn't specifically mentioned in the budget. The ripple effect of the budget on things is going to be felt over the coming days and weeks as everybody starts figuring it out. Sorry, Zoe, did you want to come in on that point?
I just want to say, I agree with what Greg said. I suppose also, of course, we've got to remember that the minimum wage has gone up, and that's including for younger people, the under 21. So maybe people might be able to start saving that little bit sooner, albeit, we're at the margins.
We've spoken to quite a few young people here in Grimsby saying, where's the aspiration? I still live at home with my mum and dad, and I'm working. When am I going to be able to leave home? Because it's not just a financial thing; it's like a mental well-being thing as well. Ambition, trying to move on. Zoe, perhaps you can answer this one. It comes from Amy. How will this budget affect me and many others who are living in a city whose council is bankrupt? I can't see rising bus prices helping any of us who are already financially stretched as it is.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things going on here. On the local government finances, Jess is absolutely right. Amy, sorry, is absolutely right that, we've seen an increasing number of councils go into basically effective bankruptcy where they can't cover their day-to-day expenses. Now, that was very much a choice by the last 14 years of Conservative government to decrease the amount of funding that they're giving local councils. So we've seen a real stretch on their budgets, higher demand and lower kind of financial support from central government. Now, the government today at budget gave them a kind of 1-year relief period, I would say. So local councils have seen a boost, but a short-term boost, and what they'll want to see is multi-year settlements from next year onwards. So I hope that they'll kind of follow that up with longer-term action. On buses specifically, I think this is a really interesting one because we saw the fare caps for buses go from £2. The cap remains in place, but it's gone up by 50% to £3 per journey. And actually, that was a really visible and tangible kind of, policy that a lot of people were benefiting from across the country. We've already seen the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, come out and say he's actually going to fund that himself, or not himself, but the combined authority to make sure that they keep their £2 fare cap. So it'll be interesting to see which other mayors across the country follow suit.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point on local councils, because local councils are a great example of the kind of areas that face the brunt of austerity over kind of the last decade or so. Those are unprotected budgets. Things like local councils, courts and prisons were the first to face the chop when we were going through fiscal consolidation. And Labour, let's not forget, were elected on a mandate to fix public services, which includes things like the NHS, but also includes the other things like local authority funding. And as you said, they have had a boost in their funding, but will it actually reverse the sort of 20% decline or so that they've seen in their spending power over the last 20 years? Will it actually make a tangible difference to people here in Grimsby?
Talking to some local business owners here in Grimsby earlier on, including Michelle, who owns where we are today, the Canopy Cafe, right in the heart of the community. One of the little kids from outside the park just came to say hello there, if you're just wondering. He'll be proud that he's on Sky News. And they were talking about, what's going to happen to small business in this budget. And they felt very much, because of the leaks ahead of the budget, that the focus was on the workers, the employees, the working people, as Labour called them, and small business being caught out and not really served by this budget. So this feeds into this question from Lewis. Gurpreet, perhaps you can start us off on this one. How can small businesses survive if the minimum wage goes up? Which it has. It could slow recruitment, it could lead to pay rises and so on. Is there any support for small businesses being announced? Because, of course, so many implications for these cost. I think, one of the headlines was the fact that, this is the biggest tax hike ever, £40 billion, and it looks like half of it is going to come from business.
More than half.
Yeah.
I think all of that is true, and on some level the government has clearly made an assessment that it doesn't think it's going to lead to wide-scale job losses, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. And whenever the minimum wage goes up, and let's not forget it's not the first time the minimum wage has gone up, we often hear cries from businesses that it could lead to job losses. And that doesn't mean that it's not true at all, of course it is. But there is some relief in this budget for those businesses. So the very smallest businesses, for example, they can offset some of those national insurance costs, so their allowance has increased from 5,000 to 10,500, but that's only benefiting the very smallest businesses.
Yeah.
There's huge...
About 4 employees.
Yeah, exactly. There's a huge spectrum between that and the sort of the very biggest businesses. So it will undoubtedly be painful, and as I was saying earlier, it's not just the businesses that are going to suffer, because the businesses are going to on some level absorb some of this, but it's also going to have an impact in terms of wages. And actually the OBR today, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which does its sort of economic forecasting, said it could actually have an impact on the economy, that these tax rises could actually weigh on consumption within the economy, on private consumption on the economy, how much money we're spending. And all of that will have a detrimental impact, not only to businesses, but to workers as well.
Okay, I've got a question here that's come in from Jason, and he's asking about the carers allowance. You know, carers are often seen as overlooked. You know, they do some of the most important work in society, but are often paid the least. Jason says, what are the new rules on the carers allowance? I currently limit my working hours to stay under the earnings threshold. Greg, perhaps you could expand on that for us.
Yes, the earnings threshold's increased, so it's good news probably for Jason, depending on exactly how much he's expecting. But yes, up to £10,000 now. You do still have to keep under that level, so you'll still have to watch how many hours you work. But generally, I think very good news for carers. About 60,000 carers in the UK expected to benefit from today's change. So again, I think that's a good example of extending an existing benefit and trying, I think, to get people who can or are willing to work back into the workplace.
And I'm going to throw in a question about fiscal rules, if I may, for you, Zoe, because, you know, there's a lot of talk about this Labour government changing the fiscal rules to allow them to increase spending on public services as well as increasing tax. Like, as Rishi Sunak there said it, you know, changing the rules to do what you want, and they have done that. How has that impacted what's going on? What have they done?
Yeah. So I actually think the changing of these fiscal rules is one of the biggest overall stories of today's budget. The fiscal rules are essentially a kind of binding set of constraints that the government sets on itself. So fiscal rules are inherently political. So it's a bit rich for kind of one former Prime Minister to say to the current Chancellor that the fiscal rules are kind of right or wrong.
They're essentially there so that, you know, it doesn't get out of control, so that spending and borrowing doesn't get out of control.
They're there to reassure both the public but also financial markets that the government is operating within constraints and stating those constraints in advance so that you kind of know what envelope you're operating into. But one really long-standing thing about fiscal rules is that the government hasn't accounted for the financial assets it creates when it invests. So unlike kind of companies where you can kind of account for assets and liabilities, government's kind of only had the liability side, and that's been corrected today. And what that means is that up to an additional £50 billion of investment can be made by the government. Now, I don't think they've used that full £50 billion of investment today, but it's certainly opened up, given them a bit of breathing space and allowed them to make some you know, significant moves towards investing in this country. We've had, you know, amongst the lowest of our OECD comparators over the last 2 decades of investment. So it's really time that changed.
I think just to add to that, whether you know, you think this is fiddling the rules or just a sensible new set of rules, the Chancellor's really gone out of her way today to make sure that we were well prepared for what was announced. There were no big surprises. I think most of the stuff we were expecting to see in some form or other, and moreover, the markets therefore haven't reacted in a very adverse way. I think this was exactly what the markets were broadly expecting, and that emphasis on sort of probity and self-discipline, so far at least the markets seem to be believing what she's saying, which, let's be honest, is good news, right? Because it means that while there may be winners and losers in the short term, in the long term we all lose if ultimately the markets lose confidence in the government.
And the IMF equally, just earlier this week, the International Monetary Fund came out to say exactly that actually, given the changes that were kind of warned about in advance, let's say, ahead of today, actually they thought they were credible and within sort of a reasonable economic framework.
And I think we can tweak the fiscal rules all we want. We can change the definitions of debt. We can do whatever we want to it. But ultimately, borrowing is borrowing, and the markets know that borrowing is borrowing. So for all the tweaks that you want to make, at the end of the day, our debt is at its highest level for a generation. And although the new fiscal rules have afforded Rachel Reeves, as you said, about £50 billion or so to invest, you'll notice that she didn't spend anything close to that. And she won't spend that kind of money immediately either, because she's still conscious about the impact that it could have on financial markets, because they can see through these changes to the fiscal rules. So I think it's also an example of, you know, we're sitting here in Grimsby digesting the budget, taking it all in, but there's a sort of another entity that's also Rachel Reeves is talking to, and that's the financial markets.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? She started the day in the House of Commons by being told off for, you know, there being so many leaks, it being out there before it came to the House. But actually, it's a good thing because it prepares businesses, you know, it calms the fears and it's not just sprung on markets and business. Let's return to the questions, shall we? We're going to talk about this question from Jess. How much extra are we now going to be spending on key public services because of this budget, and where is the money coming from? Gurpreet, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because Rachel Reeves announced, you know, big boost of investment in NHS and education, but also said that all departments are going to have to make savings. So how does that all balance out? The NHS, schools and transport was the other one she was investing in.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I actually think it underscores some of the latent risks for Rachel Reeves when it comes to this budget, because as you said, it was a huge budget, a huge tax-raising budget. Now got the largest tax burden in history, and the OBR has pointed out that people are going to really feel the pain of that. And I think anyone watching at home might be thinking, well, OK, taxes are going to go up a lot, but are my public services going to be improved? And let's not forget that's the reason a lot of people voted for Labour. They wanted a significant improvement in their public services. And on that, well, what we got today was quite interesting. We were told that actually spending on public services is going to increase by 1.5% in real terms. Well, how significant is 1.5% in real terms? Well, actually, that implies significant cuts in real terms to unprotected budgets. So a big boost for the NHS, a big boost for health spending, the largest outside of the COVID years, significant boost for schools, those kind of protected areas. But it means unprotected budgets, local councils, like I was talking about earlier, courts, prisons. Well, they're in line for significant cuts in real terms.
I'm just going to, do you know what? I'm just going to go over here and shut a window. So we've got some people coming in with their say on the budget, and they're not yet old enough to vote. So their time will come. Their time will come. Yeah. Gurpreet, please continue.
What they think of the budget later on. But as I was saying, it does imply significant cuts to all of that. And economists before the budget were saying, actually, if you want to keep unprotected budgets at their current level, so in line with inflation, you're actually going to have to increase the total spending envelope by 2% in real terms across the board. Yeah. So cuts coming down the line, and I think that is something that will disappoint voters.
Yeah, and just picking up on where you started actually about the framing, I think that was really interesting how the Chancellor really framed the tax increases and linked them to public spending increases. And actually, polling that we've done at IPPR shows that, you know, when you present people with a set of tax rises, but say they will result in increases in spending for the NHS and education, the majority of people are actually for those tax rises. So when you link actually what those taxes are going to be spent on, it is often a positive kind of reaction from the public. I do agree that the overall spending envelope has gone up, but there are going to be some departments, as you say, that are unprotected. So there's going to be a kind of fine line to make sure if the government wants to say it's moved on from austerity, there's a sort of fine line they're treading there.
I think austerity is a really interesting word, isn't it? Because before all of this, you know, there was a lot of conversation about, will this be a return to austerity? What does austerity look like? Is it just keeping budgets in line with inflation? Yeah. Is it keeping them in line with national income? Are people expecting, you know, drastic overhauls that require so much more on top of that? And actually, cuts to unprotected budgets, you know, while things like NHS and schools might be protected and boosted, I think in a lot of people's minds that will feel a bit like austerity.
I do just have to apologise because apparently there might have been some bad language coming through the window while we were having a chat. I was concentrating on what you were saying, Gurpreet, so I didn't hear it. So apologies if you did hear that. I'll have a chat with the young people outside. I'll tell them that spending on schools is going to go up. They'll love that. They'll love that. Let's talk about pensioners, shall we? Greg, I want to come to you on this one because it's been a really mixed picture for pensioners, hasn't it? On the one hand, the triple lock is staying, winter fuel allowance for many going, and there's been no help with energy bills. They're seen as a vulnerable section of society, and a lot of people have been really disappointed with the way they've been talked about and, you know, policies towards them in the build-up to this budget. How will they be feeling today?
Very simply put, I think this is a budget for young people more than it is for older people. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the benefits, for instance, for those on the lowest incomes, particularly those aged 18 to 20, you know, big increase probably in how much people are going to be taking home every day. A lot of that community is on a low wage, on the minimum wage level. Pensioners, they've lost out. They're not going to get the winter fuel allowance this Christmas, and some proportion of people claim the pension eligibility credit, but again, many aren't claiming that credit, even though they're entitled to it. And last winter, don't forget, when an energy bill spike in those expensive winter months. There was also that extra giveaway that the government put into everyone's pocket. That's not going to happen this year. So higher energy bills, no special giveaways, no winter fuel allowance. Yes, the triple lock hasn't gone away, but net, most pensioners won't feel much better off today. In fact, many will feel worse off. And that's before you get to those fortunate enough to be thinking about inheritance and tax planning, because, of course, inheritance tax reliefs have been reduced today. And so, again, people are going to be paying more inheritance tax, or their estates are going to be paying more inheritance tax if they're coming into that threshold. So I think net, probably not good news for those towards the end of their lives. And then there's a question, is that a fair trade-off? And I think some people probably feel very hard done by, and others feel, well, maybe that's the right decision. I'm not going to opine on the politics. I will just say that, I think this was what we expected at some level. It was very clearly signalled in the election campaign that, Labour was going to be tougher on some of the pensioners than the previous government was.
I want to talk about the NHS, because obviously there's a lot of spending in that, and there was so much talk before the election about the NHS. Who's going to fix the NHS? Where is that money coming from? And importantly, where is it going to go in the NHS? And I think voters, people here in Grimsby, are really interested in that, because you can talk about the hundreds of millions or billions going extra into the NHS, but actually, where is it going? And the Chancellor today was talking about modernising the NHS, and presumably, that means a lot will go into that. But I've had a question here from Olivia, who gets into that. She says, this new NHS money, is it going to be used to hire more nurses? Wards are short staffed, but many newly qualified nurses in 2024 still struggle to get jobs, which, when you talk about the state of the NHS, is actually quite mind-blowing that nurses cannot get jobs in the health service. I don't know if you've got a view on where that money might go.
Well, I'll just say, firstly, on the kind of efficiency or modernising front.
Analog to digital, she said, health to prevention.
Yes, and I know it can sound all a bit kind of techie and unreasonable, but actually, we've got some of the lowest numbers of MRI scanners and CT scanners in the NHS compared to our OECD peers. So that's something that I know the government has committed to doing, using the investment bit of the budget today. The investment bit coming from the change in the borrowing rules, whereas the tax increases is the stuff that pays for the day-to-day spending increases. And as you said earlier, the NHS is one of the biggest winners from the day-to-day expenditure, and I think there'll be an ongoing debate as to where that's best spent on the day-to-day. But of course, the staff are at the heart of the NHS, so it would seem unreasonable if they're not a key part of the plan.
We've only got a couple of minutes left together. Greg, is there anything we haven't covered from today's budget that you think is really pertinent to people watching at home today?
Look, I think when it comes down to it, you can have debates about the macroeconomics and whether this is good in the long term and how the markets react.
That's coming up after us. We're working on that.
Where the rubber meets the road is, do I feel richer or poorer at the end of each month, or do I, have I run out of month before I run out of money? And I think most households, coming to the end of this month, end of next month, and coming into the new year, which is an expensive time, that Christmas period.
We're in it. We're approaching it.
Most households are not going to feel better off tomorrow. This is a bet that over the medium term, the quality of health provision and public services provision improves, that ultimately growth comes through and helps all of us. But stealth taxes are still here for many more years to come. Rachel, we didn't extend the stealth tax programme, but nor has she curtailed it. So that's been left where it is. And unsurprisingly, Rishi Sunak didn't get to his feet after she finished talking and criticised that, because that was he was the author of that previous regime. So I think the point I'd make is that for most households, they're still going to feel very hard up. The cost of living crisis is still a reality for most people. The cost of debt is still really high. If you're paying for a mortgage or refinancing a mortgage, you're still going to feel that. So I think we've got many, many months of really, really tough budgets at a household level to come before we can hope for the sunlit uplands maybe towards the back end of next year or 2026. But for now, it's going to be a hard Christmas for many families.
OK, Greg, thank you. Greg Hand, the founder of NOUS, Zoe Billingham, director of IPPR North, and Gurpreet Narwan, our economics and business correspondent. Thank you for taking part in our panel this afternoon. Hope you found that helpful.